This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at NumberFire.com, and this is episode 555 of the Late Round Podcast, one of many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. 3 things before we get to this week's questions. First, I mentioned this before the season, but I want to remind people that I won't be taking mailbag questions via email in season. Unfortunately, when I've done this in the past, people started crushing my inbox with start-sit questions, and things become tough to manage when that happens. I just have to be realistic about my time. I don't want to ignore people, so it's easiest to just make emails off-season only. And there are places to ask those start-sit questions, like on Twitter throughout the week or during my start-sit show on YouTube each Sunday. So thank you for your understanding with that. It's greatly, greatly appreciated. Second, for those of you who listen to the show on Spotify, I apologize for the issues with last week's mailbag episode. It just didn't go to Spotify. I just wanted to let you know that I've contacted everyone that I can contact to try and make sure that it doesn't happen again in the future. There unfortunately wasn't anything that I could have done differently to get that posted. But hopefully we don't run into that problem again. Third, don't forget about this week's Listener League. Check out fanduel.com/league/listener league to join. It's a rake-free contest that costs $5 to enter and has $1,500 in prizes. You can enter up to 3 lineups in the contest. Again, that's fanduel.com/league/listener league. Eligibility restrictions apply. Go to fanduel.com or download the FanDuel app for more details. Now let's get to the questions. The first question this week is from @JohnnyBlack_HS. You said to ask this again after week 3. Have you come to Jesus on Tom Brady being awesome yet? And that with his supporting cast, finishing outside the top 12 would be very tough. So Johnny Black hit me up on Twitter after week 1, where he said, quote, "Are you ready to come to Jesus on Tom Brady and his coming 50-touchdown 2007-esque season? Never understood your take that it was very reasonable he'd fall out of the top 12, given the absolutely elite nature of his supporting cast, paired with a pass-first, throw-deep philosophy." As you'd probably guess, this isn't the only person who's hit my Twitter mentions about Tom Brady since the start of the season. And this all stems back to my bold predictions article and podcast that I did before the season, where one of the bold predictions was that Tom Brady would finish outside the top 12 at quarterback. So I want to address this, especially because of last week's 15 transactions episode where I called Tom Brady a sell. I stand by that process 100%. Brady, through 2 weeks, had a 10.5% touchdown rate. The Buccaneers had scored 9 touchdowns. All of those touchdowns were passing touchdowns. As I said on that show, if you could sell Tom Brady as a top 3 quarterback, you should do it. I still think that's a valid process. I still think that if you can sell Tom Brady at his current ranking, like if someone's viewing him as a top 2 or 3 fantasy quarterback, that you do it. I would rather have at least Patrick Mahomes, Kyler Murray, Lamar Jackson, and Josh Allen over Tom Brady. The guys who I liked more than Brady coming into the season, like Dak Prescott and Russell Wilson and Aaron Rodgers, I think you can definitely make the argument for Brady over those guys at this point. But I don't think he's substantially better. I don't think he belongs in that elite tier with the other players who have great passing numbers and rushing numbers. This idea that I don't think Tom Brady was or is awesome is honestly obnoxious. It's just silly. In what universe would I think Tom Brady isn't awesome? The take on Brady in the bold predictions piece was number 1, bold, because that's what a bold predictions article is about. It's about being bold. But number 2, it has to do with how things are scored in fantasy football and the importance of rushing and how Brady lacks that. What's interesting right now, too, is that we literally just saw some of this regression hit in week 3. It just so happens the Bucs were in an ultra-negative game script, which we can't assume happens each week, and Brady threw the ball 55 times. He had 50 attempts in week 1 and 36 in week 2. And it just so happens that Brady ended up getting a rushing touchdown. But Brady had 1 passing touchdown last week, and it came with a minute left in the game. The Buccaneers scored 3 times. 2 of those 3 touchdowns were on the ground. The things I talked about on last week's show sort of came to fruition last week. And guys, please listen to last week's mailbag episode so you know that I'm not sitting here trying to avoid an L or take a W. That's a dumb thing to do in season. It's irrelevant. I'm just trying to be completely objective to give you advice on how to approach Tom Brady moving forward. And I think moving forward, he's more of a fringe top 5 guy in fantasy rather than the literal QB1 in fantasy football. So from the preseason to now, yeah, I like Tom Brady more. It would be stupid for me to come on my show and say, nah, I still have Brady as the QB10. I like Tom Brady more than I did a month ago in fantasy football. Now that we're seeing how things are shaking out with Dak Prescott, with Russell Wilson, with Aaron Rodgers, with Ryan Tannehill, that side of things is what's changed for me most. It's not the fact that Brady has a chance to throw a lot of touchdown passes. Of course he does. Look at his weapons. It's that we've filtered out some of the competition at the position so far. And that happens all the time at every position. But that's playing a role here with Brady in my shifting view. The idea, though, that I thought Brady wasn't awesome or wasn't capable of doing what he's done through 3 weeks, that's silly, man. I even talked favorably about the Bucs passing attack on my early season schedule analysis episode. Let's just be objective. That's all I ask for. Both in how we approach the game and how we talk to each other about the game. And objectively, to me, if we look at the numbers and how this team is operating, I think it says that the other mobile quarterbacks are still better bets from here on out in standard leagues than Tom Brady. That doesn't mean that Tom Brady isn't awesome. The next question is from @LeeTheOT. Everyone is worried about Allen Robinson, and rightfully so. But with Atlanta struggling to break 20 points against a beatable Giants defense, how worried should we be about Matt Ryan's declining skills effectively derailing Calvin Ridley and Kyle Pitts' chances of having big years? Yeah, I mean, we should definitely be worried right now. Matt Ryan is playing a little bit worse than he did last year. He's actually been pressured at almost an identical rate according to Pro Football Focus when looking at 2020 to 2021. But he's been worse in a clean pocket. Now, maybe that's just sample size driven, but it's at least something to analyze after 3 games. We've got to keep in mind that this is a new offense, schematically and because Julio Jones is gone. And the target distribution is much different as a result. So far this season, over 31% of Atlanta's targets have gone to running backs. That was 14 percentage points lower last season. Atlanta's never been close to that high over the last decade. On top of that, Ryan just isn't pushing the ball down the field. This could partially be due to a bad offensive line or the lack of Julio in that offense. But Ryan's rate of throwing at 15 or more air yards over the last 10 seasons has been 17.2%. That's his average per season. So far this year, 8.6%. Now combine that with just a generally ineffective offense. That means you're not getting those chunk plays very often, and you're also not scoring a lot of points. That's a combination for a fantasy football disaster. And that's why Calvin Ridley looks the way that he does right now. Ridley has a 25% target share in this offense, and he's averaging 9.7 targets per game. Last year, he had a target share of about 25% when you prorate that 16 games, and he was averaging 9.5 targets per game. He had almost identical usage. But number one, the offense isn't scoring a lot. Atlanta's averaging 1.7 offensive touchdowns per game this year. That number was 2.5 over the last 2 years. Number two, the quality of those targets have not been as good. As I just said, Matt Ryan's not throwing it deep very often, and Calvin Ridley is feeling that. He has 6 targets this year of 15 plus air yards. He's caught just 1 of them. Last year through week 3, Ridley had 15 of those targets. He had 7 receptions on those targets. Last season, on those 15 plus air yard targets, he had 195 receiving yards and 2 touchdowns. This year, he has 16 yards. His average depth of target last year was over 15. Now it's 9. Any player that's as good as Calvin Ridley is and who's getting a 25% target share, they're going to end up being relevant in fantasy football. I think Ridley's going to bounce back. Maybe not to the expectations that we thought entering the season, but I think he's going to still be fine from here on out. The usage is at least there. The same sort of goes for Kyle Pitts. The difference with Pitts is that his target share is currently under 15%. So you've got a sub 15% target share and an ineffective offense that's not throwing the ball down the field. Again, that's a recipe for mediocre fantasy output. I would just naturally expect Pitts to get better as a player as the season goes on. But I'm much, much more willing to buy Ridley low than Pitts low. Though I think that both of them are mostly holds at this point. This next question is from @DodgersColts. Is there a difference between Antonio Gibson and Chase Edmonds? Thinking about trading Gibson for a package that includes Edmonds. Thanks for all your hard work. So yeah, there's a difference between the two for sure. When we think about players in fantasy football, we shouldn't just think about how many points they're going to score. We should always be cognizant of how they score their points, because that allows us to see their floor-ceiling combo a little bit better. Chase Edmonds is more or less doing what we expected him to do entering the season. At least what I expected. He hasn't given us that big performance, but he's been super stable in PPR formats. He has an RB 17, 20, and 24 performance. His target share is 17%. His running back rush share, 47%. Edmonds has 1 goal line rush. James Conner has 2. Kyler Murray has 2. That's what we get with Chase Edmonds. A super solid option who we hope can find the end zone from further out because he's likely not going to see that much goal line work. Antonio Gibson is not that. Gibson has seen over 81% of his team's running back rushes and over 10% of his team's targets. He hasn't found the end zone on the ground this year, and he actually hasn't had a goal line rush. But we can probably expect him to be the goal line back. I would then argue pretty strongly that from an upside standpoint, Antonio Gibson has it over Chase Edmonds. The offense isn't nearly as good, but the backfield share is there and there's room for growth. It's a lot easier to see a higher target share for Antonio Gibson than a higher running back rush share for Chase Edmonds. Now, in a full PPR format, do I think Gibson is going to finish dramatically higher than Chase Edmonds? I mean, given the information that we have right now, the fact that Arizona's offense is just better, Edmonds is seeing a healthy target share, Edmonds actually has more expected fantasy points than Gibson right now, I don't think Gibson is necessarily so dramatically better than Chase Edmonds. So if you want to make a trade of Gibson for Edmonds plus, that's fine. I still think from an upside standpoint, though, Gibson has it. Which is why I like to break down how players are scoring points and seeing volume. But if you want to do a deal of Gibson for Edmonds plus, I'm not going to stop you. As long as it's a PPR format. Just know that I think that Edmonds is much more of that floor type play than the ceiling play. And sometimes that's more than enough. This next question is from @kit_color7. Was week 3 an anomaly for Moss over Singletary due to the blowout score, or was there more to it and will apply going forward? Things definitely flipped in week 3 in Zach Moss's favor. Obviously, Moss wasn't active in week 1, but in week 2, Singletary still saw 62% of the team's running back rushes and 3 targets to Moss's 2. In week 3, though, Moss saw a couple more rush attempts and he had an additional target. And Moss played more snaps in week 3. Honestly, both players have flashed this year. I think Moss makes more sense in a game script like they just had, and he's also the goal line back. Or we should project him to be the goal line back. Considering the Bills are a good team, that makes Moss attractive to roster moving forward. He's more of a flex play, but we can feel confident that he's going to see some high leverage touches. And if he's able to maintain a 6 to 10% target share, then he's got a shot to be an RB2. I don't think we should just expect that, though. It's a two-headed monster in that backfield. I'm just saying I think Moss has more upside than Devin Singletary has now that the backfield is split again. This next question is from @ReedHSmetzer. When Jeff Wilson Jr. returns from injury, do you believe he'll be Shanny's guy and make Sermon and Mitchell take a backseat? I don't think Jeff Wilson will be a bell cow, but I think he's worth a roster spot just in case. We've seen Wilson be a goal line guy for them in the past, and that's my fear. That Elijah Mitchell sees some early down stuff and Wilson steps in at the goal line. I think that's a very real possibility. So Jeff Wilson right now is worth a roster spot if you have an IR spot. This next question is from @Mr. Davey Ross. What are the most important statistics that you look at to identify players to stash ahead of their breakouts? Calls you made like Jefferson and Higgins last year and Sanders this year. Thank you for your thoughtful words you shared about tags. Yeah, so it's really just the things that I look at with every single player in fantasy. It's all about usage. I'm constantly monitoring wide receiver snaps, their routes run, their target share. I'm watching how those things trend. Sometimes we'll see big jumps from one week to the next, but a lot of times it's just more gradual. And sometimes it's just bad luck. Like Emmanuel Sanders to start the year is a perfect example. His usage was great all around. It just didn't connect. A lot of fantasy managers are going to look at that end result. They're going to look at fantasy points scored, but that doesn't tell you the whole story at all. You got to peel that back and look at what went into that fantasy total. People are going to be more inclined to add players off the waiver wire who are scoring a lot of points. I'm more inclined to add players off the waiver wire who are seeing better and better usage. This next question is from @JacobJoe36624708. With Ayuk getting 90% of the snaps and 7 targets in week 3, do you think he's back to the player we drafted, or are we still nervous season long? It was dumb of me to not bring up Ayuk on the 10 Trend Show this week. So let's talk about him right here. I'm bullish right now. As you noted, Jacob, things looked a lot better in week 3. He's now seen his snap rate increase week over week, playing the majority of the snaps in week 3. And he was much closer to Deebo Samuel in routes run this past week. He ran just 3 fewer routes. That resulted in a 16% target share against Green Bay. So yes, the peripherals are getting better and better. He's someone that if you can still buy low on, go for it. I'm not sure he's going to live up to the expectations that some people had for him entering the season, but he's talented and he flashed serious potential in year 1. He's someone that I would love to have on my bench right now. This next question is from @Obreger56. What do we do with the Jets offense? Corey Davis specifically. Is he droppable or a hold? So I mentioned how the Jets were tough to trust on the 10 Trend Show this week, but I do think I want to amend that a little bit. I do think they're tough to trust. And Corey Davis isn't like some obvious slam dunk play. But if you've got him this week, he's not a terrible start given the matchup and the Elijah Moore concussion. But the matchup piece is important here. So far, the Jets have faced the Panthers, Patriots, and Broncos. Those aren't the cakiest matchups in the world. So if there's some sort of silver lining with how the Jets have performed so far this year, I'd say it's that they haven't had easy matchups. Week 4 should be a little bit easier against Tennessee. I'm not like guaranteeing that they do really well. That would be stupid. I'm just noting that this is the best matchup that they faced all season long. At least hold a player like Corey Davis. He still has a 21.6% target share in that offense, and he hasn't dipped below a 15% share in a single game this year. The last question this week is from @EraserW. Is the Pollard is superior to Zeke thing a reality or more like a meme? As a Zeke manager, do I need to try and trade for Pollard? Well, it depends. Did you like Tony Pollard entering the season or did you like Zeke more? Because I feel like that's how people are viewing the situation. If you like Zeke going into the season, you probably like Zeke a lot right now. If you didn't like Tony Pollard, you're probably finding reasons to not like Tony Pollard. Let me just break this down because both players are doing really well. According to Number Fire's expected points model, among running backs with 20 or more carries this year, Tony Pollard is first in success rate. Ezekiel Elliott is 4th. Next Gen Stats has Pollard first and Zeke in 3rd. The Cowboys are using them in different ways, and they're using them in effective ways. I don't think that we can just assume that Pollard is superior to Zeke because he's not doing the same things that Zeke is doing. Zeke is facing more 8+ man boxes. And only Clyde Edwards-Helaire has seen a higher percentage of his rushes come against less than 7 men in the box than Tony Pollard. Zeke is closer to average there. That's all according to Next Gen Stats. So let's just sit back and realize that they've both been good and they both are good. Ezekiel Elliott has looked much, much better than he did in 2020. And Tony Pollard has been the perfect complement. And I don't think that Pollard is just going to take over Zeke's role. And if you're someone with Zeke, you don't need to trade for Pollard. In a scenario with Zeke, Pollard then serves more like a handcuff because you're probably not going to start both guys at the same time, unless you're in a pinch. So you having Zeke or not having Zeke doesn't necessarily change my mind on whether or not you should trade for Pollard. Like I'd say anyone without Zeke could trade for Pollard if they want to. I think in those scenarios, it's actually easier to do something like that when you don't have the RB1, which is Zeke in this case. Because that way you're not putting all of your eggs into that one backfield basket. And we know that there's a cap ceiling to backfields. It limits your upside. Hence the reason Pollard becomes more of a handcuff and doesn't have the same value when he's on the same fantasy team as Ezekiel Elliott. But overall, even though Pollard's been electric and he looks awesome, Zeke's been playing really well too. It's okay to say they've both been good. And honestly, I would be pretty surprised if Zeke ends up losing his role in this offense without an injury. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you get subscribed to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks for listening this week, everyone. I really, really appreciate it. Hope you enjoy football this weekend, and I will talk to you next week.